at least a virtual room, and a very warm welcome from my side here at IDOS. You can see behind me from Bonn, which is pretty much what I see when I look out of my window, actually. Yeah, welcome to this. I think it's the fourth webinar of our webinar series where we address different questions in the topic or important topic, social cohesion, with regard in the context of development cooperation from different perspectives. And we have a very interesting perspective today. I say more about that in a minute. This is a joint webinar between the World Bank and IDOS. I won't go into detail. You can read more about that in our invitation. Today, we will be talking about social cohesion and transitional development assistance. So that's like addressing the broader topic of social cohesion, a very specific instrument or mode of development cooperation. But then again, it gets very broad because fragile contexts on the one hand are increasing. So there's more development cooperation assistance in fragile contexts on the one hand. And on the other hand, this is probably a topic of interest to those of you and us who do not only work in transitional development assistance, but also more classic development cooperation. But before doing so, let me say the following. You got an invitation from the German Development Institute, from DIE, the Deutsches Institut für Entwicklungspolitik. But as you can see now, my logo is IDOS, Institute of Development and Sustainability. That's our new name. We were renamed, so it's comes along with a new logo, but not with a new identity. So our identity is the same. So new brand, old quality for that, in our work. And to avoid that, we get a lot of questions in the chat, which has happened in the past. Let me just say there are two reasons for this change. The first reason is that the new name does more justice to what we are actually doing, because in our perception, our understanding, development cooperation and international cooperation has been changing. So we do justice to our broadened agenda as a research institution and reflecting our de facto policy advice. And the second reason is, and that is less known internationally, there is another DIE in Germany. It's an institution that does civic education, actually. So we had to rebrand for that, or wanted to rebrand for that reason as well. So having said this, let me welcome our two guest speakers today. I'm happy to welcome, I can't see you on my screens, but Henriette is still there, right? Yeah, there you are. Sorry, I can see you now. Sorry. Yeah, let me welcome Henriette Sachse from the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, and Andrew Kaiser-Tedesco from the German, in English, I said the development agency that implements the policies of BMZ. And I think I don't need to introduce Nick Mint, who is our partner at the World Bank, and Nick will comment on the presentation. And I think with no further ado, because you will say what you will present, I hand over to the two of you for the presentation, which will take about 25 minutes, and then Nick will immediately comment. If you have, for you, the participants, immediate questions with regard to the presentation, questions of understanding, please put them in the chat. I will pick them up, and we have room to answer and address those questions once Nick gave his comments, and then we will engage in a discussion on the comments and the presentation. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, Julia, and hi to everyone. Well, it's a great opportunity for us to present our findings and the agenda of our learning agenda here at the Social Cohesion Hub and the online seminar. So thanks a lot for inviting us. Yes, we would like to give you a few impressions from our social cohesion learning agenda that we put up at our transitional development assistance instrument. So I'm working at the BMZ at that transitional development assistance department or division. I'm deputy head and I'm in charge of especially evidence learning, our evidence learning agenda. So that's why I'm here today. Well, the Transitional Development Assistance is a specific crisis management instrument at the BMZ. And I'd just like to briefly introduce it to you, maybe if it's not familiar. The OECD, the peer review last year, they called us, or the TDA, the Transitional Development Assistance, called us one of the DAC's most elaborate crisis management instruments. And well, we'll take that as a compliment in terms of what we do and how we put up our projects and programs. We work in crisis countries, about 15. We have a strategic approach in 15 countries, and also work in another about 15 countries on a broader scale. Our goal is to strengthen resilience of people and local structures. So we have a multi-sectoral approach to resilience strengthening, and I maybe will go into that a bit later. We have more than €1 billion annual funding. That's for new programs and with our different partners. And we have strong partners, as was mentioned, the GIZ, but also KfW. We work with about 30 German and international NGOs and the World Food Programme, as well as UNICEF. We have specific fields of action. That's food and nutrition security, basic infrastructure and services, disaster risk management, and peaceful and inclusive communities. And the last one, the peaceful and inclusive communities, is the one area that we put in most of our agenda when it comes to evidence and impact evaluation, because we found that it's for us it's a rather new field of action, and it's the one that is also maybe the most difficult in terms of evidence generating and learning. And of course, as a crisis management instrument, we work within the HDP nexus, the Humanitarian Development Peace nexus. So we have strong links with our humanitarian partners. In Germany, that's of course the Foreign Office, but also with the longer term bilateral development programs within our Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ. Okay, the next slide, please. So evidence is important to us, of course. The €1 billion that I mentioned, they only go so far measured against the world crises. Of course, I don't have to really mention that, but that means that we need to be effective and efficient as possible to achieve our goals. And that is, as I said, strengthen resilience of local structures and people. So evidence is really crucial to achieve that goal. We decided, of course, to use evidence better, and to also generate it. So when it comes to making evidence more usable, we decided to commission 2 systematic reviews, one on social cohesion and one on gender empowerment. And that was possible with the help of 3IE. On the other side, when it comes to generating evidence, we work closely with GIZ. We're funding, for example, in rigorous impact evaluation and social media approaches to peace in Iraq. And we are generating evidence with the WFP and UNICEF and with the help of DIME. So we are funding a multi-country rigorous impact evaluation to test basically the effectiveness of our resilience programming. And that's, as it shows, it's been on the slide, that's the multi-country is in Mali, Niger, and South Sudan. So that is basically what we tried to do. We look up. Now we wanted to find out what's already there and what can we also generate in terms of new evidence. And in terms of social cohesion, it really surprised us that when we reviewed the literature, we saw little evidence. And what we saw and what was shown was that the evidence there has small effects or wasn't working at all. That means, or for us, it meant that our priority is to learn how to better address our social cohesion goal. And we had to ask the question on, what are the critical questions in terms of our portfolio? So what is holding back the effectiveness of our program so far? And what questions would we need to have a deeper look into when it comes to our portfolio? So what we did then is we started with the reviewing of the literature to see the status quo. As I said, there was an evidence gap map, but also a systematic review, and we had our portfolio reviewed as well. We interviewed 12 experts, academics, practitioners, looking for their most important questions, and we boiled these questions down to the basic clusters. We prioritized based on what we think would have the biggest biggest impact on our portfolio and the biggest relevance for TDA. And now in the last step, we're searching for opportunities to generate new evidence, also regarding, or with the help of rigorous impact evaluations. So generate new evidence within our program. And that's been basically the focus has been on social cohesion, because social cohesion for us, it's the way that we also put our impact basically on the P and the P's in the HDP nexus. So we don't look for the peace and peace building. We don't look on a very national level when it comes to crisis countries, but we focus, as I said, on strengthening resilience on a local level. And that's why social cohesion on a local level is really something important to us. And it also gives us the opportunity to see what we can do in terms of peace building on a local level. And with that, I hand over to Andrew.
Okay, thank you very much, Henriette, for that overview. I hope it comes across how much at TDA we've been putting effort into learning from evidence and listening to expertise and thinking critically about what's a priority for our portfolio. Naturally, this is a huge task, and my very high-level overview today, I hope that leads to a good discussion that can help us deepen our agenda further. But of course, in order to give us some sort of a direction, we've had to look at things very broadly and cover a lot of terrain. We have 14, our efforts resulted in 14 major questions that we have about our portfolio, of which I'll really be discussing 7 today. The bottom 7 are about operations, about how to structure a program properly to integrate social cohesion goals, or how to embed a program in social structures that could lead it to be more sustainable. We also on the bottom here have a couple overarching questions about how social cohesion connects to our main goal of resilience, and how interactions result between the different fields of actions we have in social cohesion. Can social cohesion make other areas more effective? Can we integrate with other peace building approaches, and so on? I won't cover too much about those questions today, just to give you a broad overview. Mainly we'll be focusing on the top of this pyramid here, the mechanisms that we really are interested in. How can we better produce social cohesion within the program approaches that our portfolio seems to be focusing on, both for horizontal social cohesion, which is when between group trust, sense of belonging, and other aspects, and a vertical social cohesion, so between a state and society. The first point to make about our results is that our main questions mostly follow the pattern of the most common and important approaches that our partners tend to take within our portfolio. So that's collaborative social contact interventions, peace education, peace media, and intergroup dialogues between groups. The fifth question looks at sort of overarching mechanisms for improving all sorts of approaches in how we approach social influencers and target our recipients more broadly. And finally, then we also have questions about how to boost trust in state institutions at the local level, as well as how can we better governance structures to form social cohesion when we do engage in governance programming. Let me start right off with the top first question, which in some ways is our most important question in the entire learning agenda. And it's about collaborative social contact, which here is termed as social contact between groups that is structured around some sort of common goal that the group then holds in common. The classic example is, of course, integrated sports clubs. And this question is, number one, first, because the evidence is really promising in many regards that this is a mechanism that works, and our partners rely on it a lot to try to boost social cohesion. And the main emphasis here that we have so what can actually produce this is the question of how can we as development cooperation expand our bag of tricks? How do we get more formats that rely on collaborative social contact that we can use for different contexts and combinations of constellations within the programming for the places that we face? We see a lot of use on sports clubs. We know that probably is well known to this community, an impact evaluation on football clubs in Iraq was recently made it to the cover of Science magazine. But we're also aware that this really isn't enough. The impacts that we've seen from these approaches aren't necessarily that strong. They're almost non-existent for spillovers onto the wider community. And we simply need more formats to be able to see if we can leverage this type of approach in more interesting different ways. We're also interested in how intense contact actually has to be, like how long and how expensive do these programs have to be, how much hands-on structure is required from the development partner. Again, how intensive and expensive is it really necessary for these things to be? And are there ways that we can introduce further elements like economic relations into social contact to try to deepen impacts? And finally, the ultimate question of, can we get more out of these programs by enabling spillovers, by finding mechanisms to make a wider impact on the community? And here's one thing that came up, which was using these types of interventions as demonstrations that can be visible within communities of people working together, and if that can help and work. The second question category that we have is around peace education and conflict moderation. Again, these, just like social contact, these programs are quite common. Evidence here is also promising. And we're interested here mainly in how these programs actually work, to try to deepen theory about what's going on. Is it really perspective taking, or are you strengthening elements of a group that wish to support peace through this kind of education, or are you really improving people's skills? And then secondly, again, what's the importance of spillover? How do you not just make an effect for the people that are directly in your training, but also for the wider community? The third category is narrative peace media, which is sometimes called edutainment, where you're using non-factual storytelling with an educational message. Now, unlike other areas, this programming is not common in the TDA portfolio right now, but we think that perhaps it should be. And the reason is that it has surprisingly similar levels of effectiveness in the literature to other programs, but for a dramatically lower cost per person. The imperative of this type of programming is recognizing that media really could be a megaphone. You see the icon here. And that's a powerful tool that we might not be leveraging enough across our portfolio. But we're also really interested here in the basics, because this type of programming for peace work has really not been studied enough. Henriette also mentioned that we're supporting a look into peace social media in Iraq to try to clear up some of these questions. But the questions really revolve around how long effects last, can they be reinforced on a cost-effective basis, and again, how these interventions actually work. Is it about learning about the other, perspective taking? Is it about establishing role models? Or are you doing some sort of social signaling where you're saying, look, this society is ready to move on and think differently. Everyone can talk about their new views, because here's an example of those new views that's in the public forum. Our fourth question is about intergroup dialogues, which is another very common approach within our portfolio. From an evidence perspective, it's also the one where we're the most confused. The evidence base is particularly weak here. It seems that what is there is a mixed bag of things that have really small effects or even ineffective. And we're also concerned about some negative effects that we've discussed with experts. We haven't seen any of these, but concerns were voiced that this might be a risk. Many of the interventions that are designed within our portfolio are often view problem solving as a group facing exercise. It's kind of like, let's discuss what divides us type of an approach to intergroup dialogue. And for some, that raises the concern that there might be a reinforcement of group identity within these programs, that by talking about your problems, you're actually reinforcing divisions. That's not something we know about, but it's, or we've seen directly, but it's something that we're concerned about. And so here, this is a question that we're worried about if we're actually indirectly causing harm. That's why this is bold-faced red. And the final question that we have about horizontal social cohesion is about targeting social influencers as one of the strongest potential ways to create more spillovers that we've seen. Here we're thinking about people that are opinion leaders in their communities, either formally or informally. Network mapping is often seen as a core part of doing this, by trying to identify who are nodes and the thought leaders within their communities. This is a kind of a piece of an approach that could apply to any of the approaches that I've mentioned before, in that you could try to single out social influencers for inclusion in programming. And the question is if that's something that could boost effectiveness, specifically by simply trying to work with people that are in a position to persuade others. So
Yeah.
here are, oh wait,
Sorry.
I've got two more. But just to recap,
I was surprised already. So yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, sure. Anyway, just to wrap up on the horizontal social cohesion side, you can see we've got these 5 questions, 3 about some really standard ways that our partners approach this, 1 a kind of an innovative new way, and a 5th that's about cross-cutting, improving effectiveness across the board. Just to wrap up with our 2 last questions, they're really on the question of vertical social cohesion and what creates trust with the state or encourages uptake of services. And the way we think about this here is um, uh, um, what we'd really like to make progress on is figuring out how hard would we have to work in a program to actually boost that trust. Is it something that could come quite easily, like just communicating about what the state does in terms of their services, which is usually quite cheap? Do you have to actually create a strong track record, which is obviously more effective? Or do you really want to go so far as to operate in a participatory and inclusive manner? And particularly on this one, we've encountered some concerns that this kind of an approach could actually backfire. Are we getting people's hopes up, especially in contexts where state capacity is really weak, and people come to these kinds of formats expecting some sort of change that really isn't going to happen? And one great example of this was Graham Blair's recent multi-country study of community policing, in which this type of engagement approach was exercised, and that changed people's perceptions of the police and the state, not even a little bit. We can see that there were completely null results across the board in 6 countries. And the reasoning, or at least the leading hypothesis, was that these police forces were really in no position to respond to specific citizen requests, and so no one was really impressed by their outreach. We wonder if some of this might be happening in our portfolio when it comes to trying to be more participatory, even if it's with good intentions. And the last question that we have is about representation at the local level. Development actors are often helping to strengthen committees locally, or other governance structures, or influence things that are already existing. And the question that we have is if systematic choices for which kinds of groups get represented can really create spillovers of trust within the communities that they work. If you see a better representation at your local level, are you feeling better about your neighbors in general? That kind of a question. And this question is really partially inspired by King and Sammy's recent work about the formal recognition of groups in official structures, and how that has, in case studies, seemingly provided assurance of inclusion to these groups. And we're really wondering if it's possible to bottle some of this, some of these ideas, and create development programming bite-sized that could be implemented in the context of something that we typically fund. So these are our top 7 questions on the mechanisms of what's creating social cohesion in our programming. I'll just finish by saying that trying to set priorities like this about what you want to learn about is really exciting and fun. And I had a great time doing it because you're really trying to punch to what's most important. But I must say it's also really nerve-wracking because you have a limited view, and you know you're missing things, and you know you're not covering everything, and there are things that you're getting wrong. So in that spirit, I'd really like to invite you all today to confirm and challenge what we've selected as priorities from your own experience, and give us some feedback in general. And with that, I'll turn back over to Julia.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Andrew and Henriette, for this excellent presentation. And sorry, Andrew, for interrupting you. I thought you were done, but you were perfect in time. I don't see any questions for the time being in the chat. So please, if you have questions, put them in the chat and we will address them immediately after the comments of Nick. And so I invite Nick now with his comments. And I assume, Nick, you don't have a slide. And if you refer to the questions, it might be a good idea to leave them here in the presentation. But just let us know, Nick, how you prefer it. Over to you.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Henriette and Andrew, for this overview and this presentation. I thought that was really useful, you know, there's a lot in there. There's a lot of food for thought. So I took lots of notes, and let me just briefly think about how to organize my responses. I think the first is, it's great to hear just from a policy perspective, the investment and the priority that the German government is placing on these questions, right? And very happy to see that BMZ engaged in this area, not just through financing for projects, but also by financing the research and analytical agenda. I think that's great. I will say that the 3IE review, for example, that BMZ funded, I believe, as part of this program that Henriette was referring to, was very useful for us when we did our own stock take of the effectiveness of social cohesion interventions. And so I think that that's really a public good that's helpful to the broader policy community. So I think that's the first, and to say that, you know, maybe picking up on Andrew's last point, that, you know, we're really, I think, aligned in terms of thinking about some of these questions, trying to tackle them more systematically, trying to integrate evidence into action. And so, you know, I'm excited about this conversation, but also about continuing it as we go forward. I like the research questions very much. I guess, and I may have missed this, but the question for me is kind of, how are you planning to go about addressing them? What is your timeline for it? What is the thinking around it? And is this something that you see primarily as a BMZ GIZ endeavor, or is this something that that is broader than that and involves the broader community? I see some of those questions very much as related to some of the work that we're doing, for example, and other partners. So we've been working, for example, with Mercy Corps and IPA and others on some issues that are related to this. And so I think there is a potential for continuing to bring people together and having a sort of structured conversation where we benefit from collective knowledge. What I saw less on here, and that may just be a function of how the presentation is structured and the focus that you had in this particular discussion. But one of the things that we've seen in the bank is that there's a very strong demand for social cohesion types of programs, right? So, you know, as the World Bank, our clients are governments, national governments, and then we work with them to design projects that respond to their development objectives. And so we get very strong demand, and have been for several years now, around various aspects of social cohesion, whether it's about disaffected youth, about integrating lagging regions, about peace across communities. Herder-farmer conflicts in parts of Africa, for example, come to mind. And we obviously draw on this literature of social cohesion to think about the types of interventions, but usually they're not sort of interventions where the financing is primarily focused on social cohesion, but rather there's a whole bunch of other interventions happening where we then try to focus on the how of how interventions are delivered, right? So whether it's about providing agricultural inputs or improved infrastructure or you know, mechanisms for community engagement, and then we think about how do you structure those inputs and deliver those inputs in a way that maximizes the impact on cohesion, right? And I think that, you know, it introduces a whole bunch of additional variables, right? And I guess, you know, the point at the outset that some of the evidence is very weak, some of the effects are very weak, that's absolutely correct. But there's also lots of evidence of programs that actually have strong impacts, right? And the sort of common threads across those would be, one, a really good understanding of context. And this gets, for example, at the question that Andrew raised at the end in terms of how to build trust in the state. I think the most effective interventions that we've seen have actually taken a much more specific slice of this and said, not just let's improve trust in the state as a sort of abstract entity, but let's look at the specific service providers that we want to improve trust in, whether it's mayors, whether it's the local police force, whether it is the national military or the national police force. But the more specific you are in this, the more effective I think interventions tend to be. The second is that in addition to good diagnostics and being specific about what you're trying to address, it's the quality of implementation. And that's where I think the issue about most of these programs being multi-sectoral adds complexity, right? Because then you're not just talking about the fact that you need quality facilitation and programs that really understand the various dimensions of cohesion that you want to address. But you also need to make sure that all the various inputs arrive on time, that promises made by projects are met and delivered on. And so you get into very quickly into a big realm of other variables, right? In terms of yes, we might be able to achieve this if this program runs perfectly, and we then have effective cohesion interventions. And so I think that's a particular challenge. The last thing I would say on this is that for us, we are looking at investing quite a bit of our sort of research efforts, both financial and human, into some of these questions because they are critical for us. And I mentioned this at the beginning. Many of our projects that focus on social cohesion have not, in fact, been measuring social cohesion outcomes. They've been measuring infrastructure outcomes or participation outcomes. They've been measuring how inclusive we are when it comes to reaching women or poor households, because on all of those, we have really good instruments in place. And so we know how to measure inclusion, infrastructure, participation. We are much less strong on measuring cohesion. And we developed together with Mercy Corps a toolkit for measuring cohesion outcomes at the project level. And that's something that we've been rolling out in a number of different countries. And it's actually been quite exciting because we've been able to see that, yes, you can measure outcomes at the project level. And some of the outcomes have been good, stronger than others, I would say. We had some good experiences in East Asia, some in Central Asia. But this is something that we're really now rolling out at a larger scale, including in West Africa, for example, through a number of regional and multi-country programs. And so that, to me, is kind of the next frontier, is integrating the sort of multi-sectoral programs and then combining them with robust evaluation approaches. And that, for me, is kind of where the research agenda is particularly relevant, where we can say, okay, we know that we have these projects that are going to roll out. What can we do now to plan for good impact evaluations, to plan for the right instruments to measure impacts, to start with a baseline now, but to really figure out what is it that we're going to be looking for in the future. And that is an area where I see just tremendous scope of collaboration, because some of the best evaluations of bank programs have come from external actors that have taken a look at them, right? And so I think that having a conversation around here's what we're trying to do, and then bringing in lots of people who look at, are we succeeding or failing? And people, tend to be excited about checking whether the bank is succeeding or failing, but focusing those efforts on some of these frontier issues, I think that for me is really an area of potential where we have the potential to really elevate our game in the development community, and where I think bringing together a community of practitioners would really have potentially a tremendous payoff. So let me stop there. I see that we're starting to get some questions in the chat, and I'll give you guys a chance to respond to that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, still mute. Yeah, thanks a lot for the comments, Nick. Before addressing your comments and going to the deeper discussion, we have one question of understanding regarding a methodological question to Andrew from Mike Choppins, who asked, from Raymond Sainer, who asks whether you use sociometry in your research and interventions, and how useful it is to map attraction rejection indicators of group members and how to improve the sociometric conditions of a group. I think that's probably a short answer from Andrew. yeah, let's first go to that, since this is really a question of understanding, and then we continue with the next conversation questions.
Sure. I don't know much about this methodology, unfortunately. I'll certainly look it up after we're done with this this webinar. It sounds super interesting. But given that, no, I don't haven't integrated that. I could basically touch on what it is that we did extremely briefly, and more or less what we were looking to do is synthesize the rigorous impact literature on social cohesion interventions, try to assess where the knowledge gaps really were, and then use people's judgment, both practitioners and academic experts, on where they thought the critical bottlenecks really lay about holding back effectiveness of their programming, and then bring those together in some sort of consolidated form. So that's how we identified these questions in general. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Andrew. So there's one question: how you can let me know how that you want to say something. So you can use both. You can either type it in the chat or use the hand, preferably the hand. But for some, it sometimes doesn't work. At least that's my experience and with WebEx. So then you can also use the chat. So I open up the floor now for questions and comments. Oh, sorry. And if you have a question or comment, just type in, and you cannot raise your hand, just type in Q, please.
Mike, did you want to come in?
Sure, I'd love to. And thanks for this really amazing presentation. I'm with Search for Common Ground, and we probably run one of the biggest sort of runners of these kinds of programs. And so this research is super interesting and fits with a lot of what we're doing and seeing. I had two questions from the research, or three. One is, as you define social cohesion and think about sort of horizontal and vertical cohesion, when we were embarking on our own research agenda, in consulting with experts around the world, we became very wary of the dynamic of sort of negative cohesion, particularly in development context, where sort of people, societal change, entrepreneurship, individual ambitions, particularly among young people or women, were seen as upsetting social cohesion and having a negative effect on social cohesion. And so we've adopted a social cohesion definition of sort of horizontal, vertical, and agency. So the degree to which an individual, that respects and makes a place for individuals to make change in their communities and environments, as a way of sort of addressing, people, the sort of the concern or the reality that the heads that poke above the trees can upset the social order. So I'd be curious about how you are thinking through the dynamics, the social cohesion and social quietude is not always a positive thing, particularly in underdeveloped and in some cases unjust societies. Secondly, I'd be really curious, Andrew, from your, I know we talked a lot about peace media and Search. We produce probably about 400 hours of peace media every month. And I'd be curious, one of the key questions that we're grappling with, and we see the wider sector, particularly here in the US, but in some segments of Europe as well, grappling with, is the sort of the theory of narrative peace media, which you allude to, entertainment content, edutainment type content as a driver of social change on one hand, and on the other, sort of a misinformation, disinformation lens that is rooted in some ways of a theory of change, that if people had access to better quality journalism and sort of a cerebral information, that would change social relationships in a positive way, and both of which are quite valid theories and have some degree of evidence base, but perhaps not as much as one would like. And so for us, I think that's a really interesting question, is sort of the relative impact of narrative media versus sort of information media in shaping social attitudes. And then I think the third, and it comes, I think, to also what Nicholas was talking about, was execution. On the dialogue space, I think one of the types of interventions that one of the reasons that there's such a little evidence base and yet it keeps being tried is that I think sometimes this approach is a lottery ticket. You know, if 9 times out of 10 or 90 times out of 100 dialogues are ineffective, when there is a breakthrough, there's a very meaningful breakthrough. And so I was just wondering how, you know, I think that's the most common in the dialogue, but arguably in some of these other interventions that you tested, there's that lottery ticket element where it probably won't work, but if it does, it could be transformative. And so I was wondering how some of the people you interviewed and thought through and reviewed the literature thought about that. You know, something that works 5%, you know, 5% improvement every time, versus sort of the high risk, high reward plays that people might choose to take in this space. And thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mike. May I just add an additional question from the chat from Charmin, who asks how to measure social cohesion? Are you measure it, or the analysis that you analyzed measure it, and how the assessment and indicators will be processed? And I think that's enough for the time being, and I don't see other hands raised at the moment.
Yeah, indicators. That's a whole lot of questions. Let me start by going down the list. Agency, and some people's, one person's cohesion is another person's oppression. That is a very profound point, and I think it's one that we don't think about enough. I mean, we do think about, you know, is gender empowerment, you know, sometimes destabilizing, or you know, do all the good things come together, and that sort of thing at some extent. But I do think, at least within the program people that I talk to, there's often this implicit bias that all good things come together, and that there are no contradictions in the programming we do. And I think your structure of adding agency right next to your other cohesion goals is a really interesting one, because it points to that potential tension right away. And I would agree that that's also really important. The extent that we've thought about it exactly, and that trade-off, it is something that we considered in this agenda, but it didn't move up to be prioritized so much. But it's a good food for thought that we might need to give it more thought. In terms of peace media, and whether factual or narrative-based peace media is the right way to go, I think that's a really important point. The peace media approaches that we have seen have been more factual. I think there's also an implicit bias on donor side, on implementer side, that the more factual you are, the more serious you're actually being, because you're giving people the truth, and that's the real good work of taxpayers' money. And that I'm a little wary about in general, mostly because the experts that I've talked to, who've looked at factual-based peace media from other approaches, not necessarily peace, but other kinds of peace media approaches, feel that it's really a cold coffee. You know, often doesn't engage and grip people or reach the audience in which they were looking for, and doesn't seem to have effects in other sectors. And so there's skepticism about whether or not it would really work in the peace sector. And the narrative-based stuff is the approaches that have had some evidence and some rigorous impact evaluation anyway, and seem to be at least working modestly in that regard. So definitely also an impetus to give narrative edutainment approaches more credibility, since they do tend to look like they're working. In terms of execution and dialogue, how would we deal with something that works only if it works, has a breakthrough a little bit of the time? Clearly, there's not enough evidence to really establish that rigorously, which is where we looked. But, you know, I mean, you can oftentimes, when there is a breakthrough, it's really obvious and clear that it did lead to a breakthrough, and you don't need an impact evaluation sometimes to see that. I'm not sure. We haven't done much deep thinking about this, or even thought that intergroup dialogues might fall into this category. I guess the first thing that comes to the top of my mind without much reflection is that, you know, a lot of the contexts in which we're working are not that high stakes. Like we do work at the local level in transitional development assistance. We're not looking at big piece processes or really huge negotiations most of the time. We're working much more with individual communities. And so I would tend to think that as a donor, you'd want to be looking for broad effectiveness rather than saying things that work on average very well across your portfolio, rather than thinking about those things that can be a diamond in the rough sometimes because there's so much at stake. Because oftentimes there's not so much at stake. We're not talking about the national level. We're talking about the local level, at least for our portfolio. It could be different for other people. How do we measure social cohesion? Yeah, well, in the study that we 3IE helped us develop a framework for measuring this. It had 5 different dimensions, from trust indicators to things like sense of belonging, acceptance of diversity, willingness to help and willingness to participate, and those types of metrics that are usually assessed on, you know, a 5-point Likert scale of how much do you agree with this or believe in this about a certain ethnic group or something like that. That's the framework that we use to try to conceptualize the social cohesion, and it's also a good question about how we actually operationalize that and build indicators on that for our partners. And there, it's hard to give a general message, mostly because the question is what's most useful for these programs to actually be measuring. You know, we all want the satisfaction of saying we've made a contribution to a big thing like trust or something like that. But if you're not in the context of an impact evaluation, the question is, how do you know what's actually driving that change that you're seeing in your target group? Shouldn't you be looking at some everyday piece indicators or things that are a lot closer to what it is that your program is actually designing? Because you just aren't going to be able to create an indicator as big as something like trust if you're not measuring what would have happened in the absence of the program. So it's hard for us to make general recommendations about what kind of indicators are best for a program, because the ones that are more likely to actually be rooted in what the program has achieved are going to be really specific and idiosyncratic and these kind of like everyday type of piece indicators. I'll stop there and listen to more questions. And if we have a break, I could also respond to some of what Nick said.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. We actually can have a break, but let me first invite 2 more questions, and maybe you can add your response, and maybe Henriette also wants to respond to Nick's comments. I would first address the question about traditional authorities in the chat, and there the question is, what role do traditional authorities as influencers play? Then I have a hand raised by Armin von Schiller, and I think these, depending on how many questions Armin will pose, I think there will be time now to respond also to Nick's comments, if you wish so. And I don't see neither in the chat nor, let me check in the participants list, a hand raised. So Armin.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely will try to be short. Very good points by Nick that I look forward also to your reaction to that. And I just wanted to raise 2 things that I particularly like about the agenda that you presented. This is that there is a nice mix combination of questions that are kind of core elements that we tend to do a lot, but there's also some room for innovation and trying new things out. And I think that's extremely relevant. Many times we see these exercises and either we only think about really fancy new things that we could try, or we just focus on the big thing that we're doing. And I think that combination is really good in bringing us forward. The other thing is that from the comments I get that this is particularly not a point that I think we all agree on in this forum, but I think it's really good to include quite prominently the vertical dimension into this discussion, which sometimes we forget or still forget when we're talking about social cohesion. And I think that's very important. And particularly 6th question is a question that lies close to my heart, and Kira and I know we are working on that. So happy to see that we identify a similar gap, and hopefully we can also contribute to making that gap smaller and smaller over time. But definitely there is a good gap there, as there is in the other points that you raised. I want to, along the lines, or one point made by Nick, I wanted to make some questions for us as a community. I think that on the one hand, Nick's point on do we have programs rather than focus on social cohesion, or are we having programs that focus on other things that's, I don't know, second order effects, they have something on social cohesion. I think we have to think carefully about that. But I also think that in your presentation, you raised 2 things that are extremely important. And this is, in many occasions, you said the literature, we find mixed results or unclear results. It's a question of strength. You asked around times like, do we do enough to get what we aim for? So there is a problem of trying out how strong do we have, or how strong has the treatment to be in order to get the goals. And I think that's a question that demands a lot of coordination, not only within one program, but for the whole community. And the other thing was the element of the length of the treatment. How long do we have to treat? Those 2 questions came up in several points. And I just wanted to, as a community, that these are things that structurally are difficult to address. Also when setting up, I don't know, budget for these research events and things like that. So connecting with, and this is my last point, connecting to me, I think that this is a great proposal of an agenda. And I assume that this goes beyond the capacities that PSN have. So I think it's a proposal for an agenda that others can contribute to. And I think that it's really important to think about these 2 elements, about strength and how long we have to treat. And this will demand a lot of coordination among us as a community in order to make possible to test those questions. I think it's really difficult to set up these things properly to be tested. That we have to have coordinate well in order to find ways to overcome the structural limitations in our institutions to actually be able to test these things. And thank you so much again for the presentation.
Okay, thanks. So it's again a longer list of questions. Andrew and Henriette, do you want to address those? And we will then have a last round of questions where I will add myself as well, or maybe take the opportunity in the end. So if you still have questions, please put them in the chat or raise your hand and raise the questions for that in that last round. Comments?
Well, maybe
Henriette, yeah, okay. Mm-hmm.
Would you like to start, and then I also can comment.
Should I start?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'll try to work through some of these questions. And one thing that keeps coming up is kind of like the nitty gritty, which is of how do we actually pursue social cohesion goals next to other goals, and that is not covered in these top 7. But question 9 is exactly that. Actually, is really looking at a more operationally, who do you put in charge of the cohesion component when you're doing a dual-facing program? How do you fund it? How do you structure the financing? How do you create indicators for it? How do you make sure that these things are adequately taken care of in general is one of the big questions that we had, and it seems to be very well reflected in the comments by this group. And one thing that I would say is that there has been a sense that combining social cohesion approaches with other goals is probably a fruitful way to move forward, if for no other reason than when you have general small effects, which is what we're looking at with social cohesion, one way to put those effect sizes in line with the right cost is to try to piggyback on others and on other structures so that you can get more out of a single program, and that's a fruitful might be a fruitful way forward. So that sort of raises the bar for making sure that you can do combined programming well and have the appropriate formats to do that, like having a wide variety of social contact interventions that you can create to combine with other kinds of programming, be it livelihoods or whatever. And I'm probably missing a bit, but Nick also asked, well, what's the way forward? And Armin brought that up to a certain extent. Just a few comments on that. Clearly, this is not something that's just a Germany only or a TDA only project. I mean, if we were able to put together a handful of evaluations looking at one or two or three of these questions, we'd be doing pretty well. And so it's much bigger, a bigger project than just something that we can handle alone. I think there are two important points to be made on that. One is that we need a big set of questions to ever hope of having good impact evaluations, because the truth is we can't just push a button and say, here, evaluate this over there in Iraq next year. It has to be the right opportunity. There's a lot of stuff that has to fit. The question has to be in place. The team has to be in place. The sample size has to be good. The funding has to be there. The timing has to be right. All those things have to add up. And so just to get the mechanics right, you need a lot of good priority questions to choose from that can be options. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that it's really important. I think that the entire community could do a better job of this, of coordinating what it is that we study. A lot of times there's an overriding priority for one donor to say, just evaluate my program. What am I doing? What's my money? How good is my money being implemented? But actually, the truth is, a lot of these programs look very similar across different contexts. And so just because it's one color of money doesn't mean that another program funded by another donor isn't doing a pretty similar approach in a similar context somewhere else that we can learn from and can be combined and synthesized to provide a way forward that we should be looking at. So another part of this agenda is thinking about how do we make sure we learn from other evaluations, regardless of whose money actually funded the program, to inform what we do at transitional development assistance. I'll stop there.
Well, I can.
Henriette, do you want to come in? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I can come in. And I think Niklas also asked about, well, yeah, GI said BMZ, and Andrew answered already. But I'd just like to add that, as I said, we're also working with DINE, World Bank, but also with WFP, World Food Program, and UNICEF in terms of impact evaluations. But we also want to bring the NGOs more into this debate as well. So we had an in-depth workshop this year already on social cohesion and on the possibilities of NGOs also to implement within our programs impact evaluation. And also DEWAL is putting up a new funding line just recently, and so in order to bring in more impact evaluations in general, not only on the topic of social cohesion, but I mean this is basically a priority for the BMZ in general, to support more evidence generating and more and funding more rigorous impact evaluations. So this is basically also one answer to the questions of, can we do this alone? No, we can't do this alone. And also we need, a lot of partners that also are interested in those methodologies. And as Andrew, said already, a lot of things have to come together, to be right timing, right topic, right program, right funding. So that's why it's good that we have a broader base and different partners look into same issues or same questions. And yes. And then also maybe to the multi-sectoral approach. I think this is also key. Of course, it makes it maybe more difficult than to kind of, you know, take out the impact, the single impact of social cohesion, but to strengthen resilience. And I mean, that's at least our goal from the TDA perspective. To strengthen resilience, we need a multi-sectoral approach anyway. So, and we put that together with the social cohesion focus in most of the programs. But because this is our strategic goal, we also have to we have to have that multi-sectoral approach as a priority. And then the second one would be, you know, the second step would be, okay, to see how we can measure different impacts of those different approaches. So, but yeah, that's why I think, well, it's going to be a multi-sectoral endeavor, and then we have to see what we can find out, or how can we include those questions that we want to pose and want to see and want to learn more in regard to social cohesion. And last point, I think Niklas also mentioned the context and the analysis, and I just would like to mention also this is something that we really see as a joint endeavor. Analysis, to share analysis should be more common. So we try to also foster joint analysis approaches across our partners, because it's especially in high risk countries, it's very expensive, of course, to have all these different types of analysis in terms of peace and conflict analysis, gender analysis. We have now brought in resilience analysis. So this is, of course, something that's really key, that analysis are shared and that they can, you know, be used by different actors, also in terms of different priorities. So yeah, I hand back to Julia. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the responses. So I have two more questions and a comment from the chat, and I have, as I said, two observations myself. So one question is about armed groups, posed by Marine Gastier, who asked whether there are studies that you looked at that show that the program had an impact on the influence of armed groups on the outcome. Then Mike asked the question whether you have any insights on timing. So how much time does it take that social cohesion takes root? And then a comment by Patricia from a perspective of psychology, and she notes that a minimum contact, and not only the quantity, but how people engage with each other and how the contact takes place and occurs, is very important for the impact on social cohesion. I think a very important observation for development cooperation. And I see an additional question for Nick from Thai, who asks, sorry if I mispronounced the name, they're using the World Bank Mercy Corps Social Capital Cohesion Toolkit in a public works project in Ethiopia, and wonder whether that would be possible for you, Nick, to share some information about that toolkit. And I have two observations. So the first one is, I mean, except of that sixth question on trust in institutions and the observations on the vertical level, I mean, this is a very much actor-centered, which is typical also for transitional development assistance, a very actor-centered field of international cooperation. At the same time, if we assume that social cohesion, if it goes beyond small communities, will take a lot of time to take roots, and there is a need for institutions that can shape social cohesion, which also takes time. So I wonder whether not any approach that wants to support or aims to support social cohesion on the long run doesn't necessarily need to address institutions as well, and not only on the local level, but really a multi-level approach that looks at different levels in order to avoid that in-group, out-group problematic that you address, I think, in your second question. And then my last observation is fragile states. I mean, it's good to focus on fragile states, and we know there are more and more, but then are fragile states in context only those that are in conflict? And if it's like that, then, I mean, I don't think that fragile states are conflict states only, and I think that's including the World Bank definition, BMZ's definition, not the state of the art, right, and not OECD, but the way you put it, it's more about conflict-affected contexts. And then support to social cohesion is more of a reactive, fixing the problem approach, and not a long-term building structures approach, which would probably require it. So my question is, how does transitional development assistance here refer to development cooperation? I think that's something we cannot tackle now in the remaining few minutes, but it's something that we have to think hard about, I think. Thanks. And I will check whether there are more questions. No. So over to you.
I can quickly handle some of these time frame questions. I think, Henriette, you're best placed to talk about what are fragile states? Can TDA work at the national level with big institutions in general? I think those are some interesting points. Yeah, just to quickly touch on Mike's question. I think Patricia is probably the best person to answer your question, Mike. I don't know, and that's why it's one of our main questions on our agenda. Is there just seems to be not enough studies that have varied the length of contact to try to figure out how intense does it really have to be, and how expensive then does that approach really have to be? And that's one of our main questions that we have that we think is really important. To Patricia's point, yeah, the quality of the interaction is really important. The expert interviews that we went through did touch on that, and a lot of times the conversation went like this: yeah, there are Allport's famous questions or conditions from his 1950s paper about when social contact is really going to work. We kind of think that the most important thing to have in the mix is this collaborative goal when you have social contact, and the quality of that collaborative goal is like the most important thing. Now, obviously, that's expert speculation. There's not the evidence of that is not huge and great, but that's why we chose collaborative contact as really that condition that needs to be of really high quality within that group for basing programming in the future around. And with that, I'll stop and shift over to Henriette for the big institutions and what are fragile states anyway.
Well, quite hard questions at the end. Yeah. Well, thanks, Julia. But no, I mean, fragile states for us, it's not the same as conflict-ridden states. So this is specifically a no, I'd say, because we rather talk about crisis or countries in crisis or fragile countries, and it's not only conflict, an open conflict or long-term conflict. But crises and shocks can be felt differently, as we saw with the COVID pandemic, for example. That was also a shock, and we try to strengthen resilience, as I said. That's the main goal. Strengthen resilience so that people and communities and also institutions and structures can be more resilient to further and to future shocks. So and maybe that's also the answer to the question. I mean, of course, institutions are key. Yeah, institutions on a local level, but also on a national level. But then that's maybe not our cup of tea, basically. And of course, I mean, this has to do, or we need to join dots here and also bring in longer term development cooperation. I mean, this is they and our bilateral teams, they work very often, and then also often with the partner countries and the partner governments to strengthen institutions, governance institutions that also, you know, try to bring in more trust to the vertical and social cohesion aspect. But for the TDA instruments, because we focus on a rather local level, for us, the local authorities, the local institutions, the local structures, they are our main focus. So, but of course, a multi-level approach to strong institutions is key. But then we have to, you know, bring in other partners or other instruments also within our BMZ, but and also within the international donor community. And I think this is specifically a coordination and cooperation topic for specific countries. Yeah, I think maybe we stop here.
Okay, yeah, thanks so much for these answers. Very well taken. And looking at the time, I think it's time to close this webinar. I'm afraid that we would have more questions and comments to be discussed. And I think there are now very interesting questions in the room that, I mean, you, Andrew, said you will continue to work on those. And Nick also suggested that we should find a way to tackle these questions as a joint effort in this community. And I think that would be really important, because what we also know is that for impact measurement, it's not only important to have good questions, but we also need a high number of comparable cases or cases that allow us to generalize our findings so that they can build a basis for solid and rigorous theories of change for development cooperation projects. So yeah, with having said this, I wish you all a good evening and hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as I did. We will continue with this webinar series, and you should have an invitation for the next webinar in your inbox in due course. So this is every third month this takes place. And if you feel that you work in a project or have a topic that you would want to contribute, also let us know, as this is an open space for everybody to contribute as well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, everyone.